Hello, everyone. My name is John, and this is Policy War. Before we get into our episode today, I'm going to go ahead and let my co hosts introduce themselves.
My name is Russell, and I am the stereotypical progressive on this show.
My name is Matthew, and I am a centrist with a libertarian slant.
And I am the conservative offering that particular perspective on this podcast. So today we're talking about something not only very important, but rather divisive in American politics. Something that this podcast has surprisingly not covered in the past. Today we will be discussing gun control and gun policy. We're doing this partially in response to the two tragic events that happened last week here in the United States. Two shootings that have claimed more than 10 lives. These are obviously tragic events, and we all mourn the loss of those who lost their lives in these particular events. But regarding what we are actually going to discuss today, we are going to focus first on the idea of background checks as introduced in a new piece of House legislation. This legislation, called H.R. 8, introduces two important things that obviously there is a great deal of discussion and disagreement on. First, and primarily, H.R. 8 would require what is called universal background checks. Currently in the United States, you are required to submit to a background check through the National Instant Check System, the NICS system, whenever you buy a firearm from a federally licensed dealer, a dealer with what's called an FFL. However, you do not need to go through a similar background check if you are engaging in a private exchange between two private parties within the same state. If a firearm crosses a state border in such an exchange, the firearm will need to go through an FFL dealer. However, you can completely avoid the background check by engaging in that intrastate private exchange. What universal background checks would do is make sure that anyone that is ever exchanging a firearm with another person, whether it be a sale or a gift, they would have to go through a background check. There are certain exceptions for renting firearms at a range or gifting a firearm to a direct family member, but by and large, any exchange of a firearm would require a background check. The second thing that this bill does is increase the time for what's called a default proceed. In the NICS system, currently, if the check cannot be completed immediately, as is typical, after 3 days, the merchant has the option to proceed with the sale without the background check going through. H.R. 8 would extend this time to 10 days, after which a person could appeal to the government, and then they would have 10 more days. And if that time then expires, then the merchant could go ahead with a default proceed. These are the two primarily implementations of HR 8. And I just want to start out with getting opening ideas from my two co hosts talking about whether or not this bill is good and what sort of things we would also like to see in regards to gun control. Matthew, let's go ahead and start with you.
I would have to say that I agree with the idea of universal background checks because there is quite a few ways in which you can have people, quote unquote, slip through the cracks. So, for instance, you look that people have to have either domestic abuse case or they need to have a violent felony. And so just having a broad range background check may help find people who are suspicious but haven't quite crossed those checks yet. Maybe they've committed other things, or maybe it allows the government to focus more on actually seeing those people that use these loopholes, like those who are trading within state lines or not triggering an NICS, if I recall correctly, background check. So I am one for it. I can also see the harm that people would likely have, though the harms people may see in it with gun registration, but this is just acquiring a gun. It's not requiring people to register. So I see nothing wrong.
I also agree that these initiatives are things that probably should have been passed decades ago. It seems obvious that everybody should be mentally checked and criminally checked to see if they should own a firearm. This is obvious, and there definitely shouldn't be the loophole of being able to basically go for a gun auction and just buy a gun with no regulation behind that. And that should have been covered up years ago, also, because The reason I say that is because people are so scared of terrorists. Think how easy it is for terrorists to get a firearm in the United States. Think how easy it is for a person who just got out of an insane asylum to just go to a gun auction and just get an AR-15. Now, I do want to say that I'm not your average American. I don't have an AR-15. I don't have a flamethrower. Thank you, Elon Musk. I don't have a sawed-off shotgun, and I don't have a trusty Glock in my pocket. Okay, I've been on the shooting range a couple times, but I'm not a gun owner. But I know the feeling it gives. I know the feeling of power it gives, but it's also a very dangerous weapon in which one person could kill 30 other people in under a minute. These two mass shootings that happened within a week, really, the word of the week is desensitization, in the sense that people are caring less and less about the shootings that happen. It isn't having the impact as it used to, because shootings have happened every week. 2019, according to Christopher Herman, professor at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the City University of New York, he said shootings have become normal for the United States, and unfortunately, there was a mass shooting once a week in 2019. No other state is like this unless you're almost in the midst of a civil war. But these are just homicides that happen randomly for very mentally damaged individuals. It's a problem with a lot of things, and I don't think regulation can really solve it. We can't ban guns, obviously, and we're not going to talk about that unrealistic solution on this episode. We lost that chance 20 years ago when Australia and Japan have done it and have had much less homicides, obviously. So that's not the solution. I think we really need to change the culture around these weapons. And I can talk many more aspects of it, but I think the main problem is the Second Amendment, in all honesty. Our Constitution is the founding document of this country, yes, but it makes this country have an inability to change things that the founders could not predict. Well, yes, they just did a revolution against the British government. I don't think we'll need to do a violent revolution against our current government anytime soon or centuries later. We are a functioning democracy. I know that's been tested recently, but we are a functioning democracy, and I don't think the tenets or the principle the Second Amendment was founded upon is still really credible today. I think that's one of the worst issues with this country, is just saying it's in the Constitution, therefore we shouldn't change it. I don't think that's the mindset we should have when change is obviously needed. And there's many other problems with gun laws and the culture around guns in this country that we'll discuss later on, but it'll take a lot more than these laws to fix the tragedies that happen, it seems like, all the time in America.
Well, I'm glad we've got a good diversity of ideas between us. So I heard some things that I agree with and some things that I disagree with. And in the intent of collegiality, I'm going to start with the things I agree with. Russell, you made an excellent point regarding the fact that regulation is not necessarily going to save us from where we find ourselves. There needs to be a cultural shift. There needs to be deep changes, not only within our society, but in the way we respond to certain things. And I think that will be the most effective means of curbing this violence. I also agree that we need to curb this violence. It's a very deep problem, and one that is sort of unique to America, at least in its form. And we obviously want to make any intervention ensure that it doesn't merely change the form of the violence. Now, moving on to where I have some disagreement. First and foremost, I disagree with your contention that the Second Amendment is some relic of colonial times. I believe it is just as relevant today. And frankly, if people did want to change it, we have a process for changing the Constitution. And the reason that we haven't repealed the Second Amendment is because people have not been able to create a critical mass of people that all want to repeal it. If they could create that critical mandate, then they would change the Constitution. But now I'm going to move on to specifically about H.R. 8. And let's talk about universal background checks. I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea, because I do think that if you are going to acquire a firearm, you should have to go through a background check. That being said, my problem is with the inevitable enforcement mechanism. And Matthew, I want to thank you for bringing it up. Inevitably, in order to enforce universal background checks, it will require a national registration of firearms. Otherwise, you would have no basis for knowing whether or not a person transferred one firearm to another. According to laws now, the ATF only is supposed to keep records of firearm purchases for so long, and then they get thrown away. I am not 100% sure that actually happens. I would not be surprised if there are boxes and boxes and databases full of all those documents that were supposed to be thrown away, but I digress. And I am wholly against the national registration of firearms, and all you have to do is look at history, and that is always a precursor to the government further infringing on what we have here is the right to bear arms. And I'd also like to briefly talk about the constraining the default proceed idea, where currently merchants have 3 days, and if the National Instant Check System can't give them a result within those 3 days, they have the option to proceed. I agree with this, and perhaps we can extend it very, very minimally, but I feel the better intervention is to simply make the NICS system better, as we have seen certain failures with that system. And the reason I think this is because here in the United States, whether we think it is a good idea or not, we do have the right to keep and bear arms. That is a constitutionally protected right, and it is unfair to strip someone of that right or to prevent them from exercising that right because of the failure of a government system. So, therefore, I do believe that absent an affirmative saying from the government that you should not have a firearm, you should be able to get one because it is your right to keep and bear one unless you have been stripped of that right by due process of law. And so I absolutely disagree with HR 8. I do not think it is something that should pass. To end, I would say to advocate for something that we actually should do, I'll go back to how I agree with Roussel. We need to have a significant cultural shift, and I feel that is eminently more important than a, frankly, in my opinion, short-sighted idea that banning guns or banning certain guns even will have a major effect on this violence.
I do want to say, even if national registration of all guns, which I think is unrealistic at this time and point, because everybody knows there's more guns than people in America, it'd be a very hefty process, and I don't think many would ally with the regulations per se. Your basement gun collector or your affluent gun collector who has 1,000 guns just hidden away may not show the government this information for some reason. But I do want to address the increased time the FBI has to check people who do purchase weapons, which I do agree with in the bill, because currently it is a max of 3 days, and the bill would increase it to 10 days. This is more similar to Canada's system, in which people who've gone to prison or been involved in felonies or say have had taken medication to stop some sort of mental disorder, that would be easier to find if FBI wasn't so strained with time. This thing's called the Charleston loophole, where basically the FBI has to conduct a massive background check on hundreds of thousands of people in a small time span of 3 days, and many people get past it. So I do think that needs to be done. I agree that national registration would just increase hostility in the country in general and just give more of a divide where we don't really need one. Um, but I do disagree that the private auction of gun sales should not be restricted further, because it just seems like another obvious loophole in the system. We do need to change the culture, but the hard question is, how do we do that? I mean, I would like to hear your thoughts. What are some of the things in American culture that cause these shootings that are so common?
I would say that first of all, I agree with you whenever it comes to expanding the time frame at which these checks can be performed, so we can kind of close the Charleston loophole. And I would also kind of like John to keep in the back of his mind what type of things would he have against that, because delaying somebody owning a firearm by, say, a month or two should not be harmful to anyone, as long as we have a safer society to know that this person is mentally capable of owning a firearm without committing danger to others. Now, back to your question about culture. I believe that one of the things that needs to change with the cultures. We need to have more of a limitation on what firearms people can own. So not restricting everybody's rights to it, but the type of firearms people can own. For example, magazine sizes or automatic weapons or things like that. So those people who want to partake in hunting can continue to partake in hunting and still shoot at the range. Maybe allow those things at ranges. Like if there's a shooting range in Las Vegas that wants to have a Gatling gun, by all means, as long as it doesn't leave the premises and nobody's hurt by it, let them have their fun there. But individuals should have a really difficult time, if not impossible time, owning those things. Maybe redefine it kind of like Japan, where you can have a firearm for hunting, but perhaps it's a bit more restricted in a sense. It's like you can have a rifle, but you don't need one that has a large capacity, because if you're really going to miss a deer that much, should you really be hunting? So basically, I think the way we should change gun culture is by making guns have a purpose instead of seeing it as just a hobby or just a random thing for people to buy.
So I'm going to address something from you, Roussel, something from you, Matthew, and then I'm going to answer Roussel's question about the culture. So, Roussel, I'm glad that a couple of times this podcast, we've been able to find some consensus, because you've made some good points about failures in the NICS system. I agree that that needs to be improved. Not only do we need to improve the amount of information that's going into that system, we also need to improve the response that we have to people who fail. In order for a NICS check to go through, for a federal firearms dealer to run that specific check, a person has to fill out a form called 4473. On that form, there's a question which essentially asks, are you eligible to own a firearm? To lie on that form is a felony. Therefore, if someone has a check that they fail, absent a very extraordinary case where someone didn't realize they were ineligible, that person has committed a felony. And those are horribly prosecuted. As something to the degree of, according to the Government Accountability Office, 0.9% of the time. That is a horrible track record, and I believe that if we have people that are already committing felonies regarding firearms in this way, those are the people we need to focus on prosecuting. So now, Matthew, I'm going to quickly turn to you. You talk about things like automatic weapons, and those are already extremely, extremely difficult to get. They are prohibitively expensive for the vast majority of people, and they require an ungodly amount of documentation with the government to actually procure. Also, you make a lot of points about how we need to not have what are called high-capacity magazines, but in reality, they're standard capacity. Things like 30-round magazines are what come with these rifles. They are not high capacity. But you've made a lot of points about hunting, and I would only say once again, the Second Amendment is not written for hunting. And as long as we have that amendment, as long as that is still good law in the United States, which I hope is forever, then as American citizens, we don't need to justify our right to bear arms in the context of hunting. And so finally, I want to answer Roussel's question about the culture, because when I spoke previously, I advocated that this is an excellent idea and this is something we need to pursue. And there's a few things that we need to do. And one of the big things is we need to have a greater focus on mental health. And here's why. Overwhelmingly, when we see these tragedies happen, it is because a person is deeply, deeply struggling. For example, in the recent shooting in Atlanta, the man that went and opened fire at, I believe it was a massage parlor, that man claimed that he had a sex addiction and that he was trying to get rid of these women to remove that temptation. That, by every definition, is a person who is not sane, who is not mentally well. And it only further shows that something that we've been saying for years and years and never have actually done anything about, the mental health in this country is very, very poor. And we need to make that a much more important point in our implementation of things, which might help to curb this violence. I think that's the largest thing about our culture that we need to do. I think it is, and this is a very stereotypical conservative talking point, and I'm sure both of you will inwardly groan when I say this. But fundamentally, I think the issue is not with the weapons themselves. I believe the issue is most fundamentally and most easily intervened with is the people that are using these weapons. So we've talked about background checks a lot, and we've kind of gotten into a more philosophical thing about the right to bear arms, but let's pivot back to something that's a bit more concrete. So within the United States, we have something called the Lawful Commerce in Arms Act of 2005. What this act did was essentially extend some immunity to liability to gun manufacturers. Essentially, they cannot be sued because the weapons that they manufactured were used in a crime. This, I want to be clear that this law does not give them a blanket immunity to the entire body of tort law here in the United States. Tort law is just generally, it's when you sue somebody because they injured you somehow, either physically, financially, mentally, etc. They are not blanketly immune to all tort law. If they make weapons that malfunction, they can still be sued. If they knowingly place their weapon into the hands of someone that is ineligible, then they can be sued or even prosecuted for negligent entrustment of that weapon. And so there's still a body of law by which they can be held liable. It is specifically for suits regarding them having their weapons used in crimes. Recently, the Biden administration, and this has been a talking point, especially for the Democratic Party for a good deal of time, is they want to strip these protections away. So first, I just want to ask the both of you, do we think that is an appropriate measure, and what do we think the potential fallout of that might be? Matthew, let's go ahead and start with you.
I see a lot of gray areas in between, so I wouldn't go that extreme, but I would at least start with advertisements and at least restricting what they can do to advertise these products. I'd consider it similar to alcohol or similar to cigarettes in a way that people need to be well informed. There needs to be strict regulations on it. You shouldn't be touting a gun as a fun thing to play around with on television or in magazines or anything, because it's can be quite a deadly object. It should be seen as, if you have a hobby and you want to, shoot at a range, you shoot at a range. But it shouldn't be something that's advertised like Coca-Cola or any other consumer product.
While the gun is definitely a different product than, say, food or appliances, people that produce and sell these weapons need to be held at a higher accountability than the regular business, also along with that. The PLCAA is a law which protects the manufacturers from basically being held responsible when people they sold the weapons to commit a violent crime. And that's completely understandable, but I feel like this law is infringing on the courts and allowing the judges to decide this. Now, any reasonable person would say, okay, we have a local gun store. You sold a gun to this individual who passed a background check. Seemed to be nothing wrong with them. And then they went home and, say, shot their neighbor. You had no way to realize that. You did not act negligently. So therefore, this suit is not going to go through. The government should allow the judicial process to handle it. And there's no need for this additional protection for these companies that are making millions and billions of dollars. I don't think that's necessary. They don't really do it for many other companies. And the only reason they do it for these companies is because the NRA funds the Republican Party more than many other businesses. Just recently, they moved out of New York because their records were being searched, and they cited the PLCAA as a reason for the Attorney General not to go on them for an investigation of corruption. And then they declared bankruptcy and moved to Texas. So obviously there's some corruption in this business that they should not be protected from. And I think this law is really unnecessary and just brings less accountability to these manufacturers rather than more, which is the opposite direction I think we should be going. This can easily work itself out in the judicial system like every suit does. And I don't think this law is really needed at all. And I'm fine if it gets altered.
So I certainly understand that, and I agree with you when you characterize that most of these lawsuits, they're not going to show the necessary negligence or recklessness or whatever standard is required for this particular brand of tort law. The reason that we have this particular law that insulates gun manufacturers in this way is so that those cases don't constantly need to be litigated. Because here's the reality. If this law was not in place, as soon as anything with a weapon went down, you would have an entire just mob of lawyers and litigants coming after these manufacturers looking for a settlement, or at the even sometimes looking to punish them politically by filing these suits. And these suits, even though they're relatively simple for the legal counsel to win, because frankly, there's not usually enough evidence and there's not the real negligence or recklessness, they are still expensive to litigate because you still have to use your lawyers in order to fight these cases, in order to get them thrown out of court. So, at least as far as I'm aware, the intent of this law was to take a particular Brandon case, which, absent extremely extraordinary circumstances, there would be no case. There would be no reasonable call for action. And so, therefore, they've insulated the manufacturers from these cases so they don't have to spend time constantly litigating these things, which would significantly cut into their financial resources. And that's why I believe this is called the protection for lawful commerce in arms. It's protecting that industry so that you don't get politically or financially motivated people constantly bringing in frivolous lawsuits in order to try and clamp down on these people. I do want to, you mentioned the NRA, and I do want to talk about them briefly. The NRA has been losing membership progressively over the course of the last decade or so. And along with that membership, they're beginning to lose some power because a lot of conservatives are becoming a bit disaffected by some of the activities that they engage in. And so I think one of the reasons behind them declaring bankruptcy is, yes, like any business, they want to avoid the peering eye of a clearly hostile state in New York, and that's why they're clearly moving to Texas, which will be less hostile. But frankly, the National Rifle Association, they're consistently losing power, and I think even though there are some genuine gripes to have about that particular organization, gripes that certainly I and some other conservatives will have, I don't think it is necessarily the ungodly boogeyman that some people either make it out to be or would like it to be. So we are running a bit up against time here. So I do want to take this opportunity to get kind of final statements from both of you. And where do you think the nation needs to go in regards to gun control and gun culture? Just sort of make your case and of your general perspective on this issue. Sum up the things that you've said already.
Well, the story of gun crime in America is the story of America's participation in the world. We are a nation that was founded on war, and we've been in war for almost the entire existence of this country. We are seen as warmongers around the world, and Americans are stereotyped as McDonald's eating, gun toting, ignorant people. And sadly, we should reverse this perception, but we are resistant to do so ourselves. And that's really the problem with it. The whole world is watching America, seeing the faults of America, but we ourselves cannot seem to change it. And I think the time for change is now. We're going to keep having this conversation over and over and over again until politicians start realizing that they should care more about lives than their pocketbooks. I wish this was the case, but sadly it is not. But I think with conversations like this and shootings that will begin to spike up again as the lockdowns keep decreasing, people will realize that we need more than regulation. We need a different conversation about guns in this country.
I would have to say that I can find points in which I can agree with both of you, and I can disagree with both of you. I agree with Russ that guns aren't going to go away, and that it's going to have to be a change in culture. And I see that there needs to be restriction on firearms. That being, of course, increasing the rate at which people are given background checks, maybe delaying the time frame at which they can possess a firearm, and limiting the capacity of firearms, because they shouldn't have, a high capacity for self-defense or for hunting purposes. And even then, if you're looking to shoot on a range, yes, there's a cost to you that you fire a bit less, but think about it like this. You don't have other people who are going to have the higher capacities committing crimes elsewhere. Yes, it's a little bit of a sacrifice to make, but in the grand scheme, we're still one of the most free countries when it comes to guns on this earth, probably barring countries that don't have a government to enforce gun laws whatsoever. They're probably in civil wars or just getting them from countries around the world. We're the most, I guess we could say, structured in that sense. So whenever you see a mass shooting go on and you see this problem be pushed up as, oh, well, don't jump to guns, it makes you think, okay, if we've had this happen every week for, what was it, 2019, then obviously there's something wrong. Obviously something needs to happen. I think people get caught in the headlights and they think that one party wants to take away everybody's guns. That's not the idea behind it. I think it's more of a thing of, we want there to be more hurdles that one has to jump in order to get a firearm, because there are many people out there who want to own guns for legal reasons and don't shoot people, but there are also quite a few people who are abusing this system to possess firearms that are ticking time bombs waiting to explode. And so we need to keep the industries accountable. We need to make sure that they aren't advertising their firearms as play toys. They need to be used for a function, a purpose, and mass shootings does not need to be one of them. If it's self-defense, by all means, although I would recommend another non-lethal form, but that's just my personal opinion. If it's hunting, by all means, I understand that there, but there needs to be a change and there needs to be a purpose behind it. Now, I understand John has a really strong stance on federalism and constitutionality, but I agree with Russ that a bunch of older white men in the 18th century can foresee some things, but they can't foresee everything. That's why we're stuck with the Electoral College. That's why we're stuck with gun rights. I don't see an uprising coming soon. And even then, I don't see the purpose in owning higher capacity weaponry if one were to happen. Off to you, John.
I will say one quick final thing, and then we'll wrap up here. And this isn't to advocate for any position, only to explain something that I believe I've seen. And that's that we can have every technical conversation on this issue, that we can discuss statistics and we can discuss the law. But fundamentally, I think this conversation boils down to how it is in other contentious issues here in the United States. It's a fundamental question of value. And I believe that the two camps here overwhelmingly are those that desire security, and rightfully so, and are willing to cede some liberty to get it, and those that desire liberty, and rightfully so, and are willing to cede some security to get it. I believe that the difference in value is on which you desire more and which you are willing to cede. And obviously, we are all at different levels, but I'm grateful that we can have conversations such as this, where we can compare those values and have technical conversations and still engage as Americans. So I want to thank all of you for coming here and listening to us today. We really enjoy talking and having you guys listen in. If you like what you hear, please go ahead and give us a rating on whatever platform it is you use to listen to podcasts, and we will see you next week.